Imagine you're in a quiet room, just you and your reflection. But something is wrong. The mirror, instead of reflecting your movements, seems to have a life of its own. Have you ever had the feeling that your reflection is watching you? Or worse, that it has secrets it doesn't want to share? Today we're going to dive into a story that explores the darker side of our reflection. Something scary that hides right in front of our eyes, waiting for the right moment to reveal its intentions. If you love horror stories that give you chills and make you question what's real, subscribe to the channel and share with your friends. This helps us bring you more and more macabre stories. Get ready, because this story will make you look at the mirror in a very different way. Now take a deep breath. Let's begin our journey. Our protagonist, Tiago, had a common routine. He was a reserved young man who liked peace and quiet and spent most of his time alone in his apartment, a compact but comfortable place, with a decor that reflected his calm and introspective personality. He was never afraid of being alone. On the contrary, he enjoyed the silence. But everything changed one seemingly normal night. It all started with something that seemed insignificant, an antique mirror that he found at an antique fair. There was something mesmerizing about that mirror. It was large, with a heavy dark wooden frame, decorated with detailed carvings that seemed to tell a story of their own. Even so, Tiago felt a strange attraction to it and decided to take it home. Little did he know that by bringing that object into his apartment, he was opening a door to the inexplicable. After installing the mirror in the hallway, he noticed that something was different. He couldn't explain exactly what it was, but every time he walked past it, he felt a chill run down his spine. At first, he attributed this feeling to the fact that the mirror was old, perhaps even a little dark, but that would soon turn into something much more sinister. One night, as he was walking down the hallway, Tiago noticed that his reflection seemed late. He turned to look at the mirror, and his reflection remained with his back to him for a second too long before turning around. He laughed at himself, thinking that he was just tired and seeing things. But deep down, he knew that this was not normal. As the days went by, his reflection's behavior became increasingly strange. It wasn't just being late, but subtle movements that he wasn't making. A slight smile when he wasn't smiling, a tired expression when he was feeling excited. With each new strange behavior, Tiago tried to ignore it, convincing himself that it was all just a game of his own mind. But a part of him couldn't ignore that feeling that something was terribly wrong. Have you ever had the feeling that something or someone is watching you, even when you know you're alone? That's exactly how Tiago felt. And the more he tried to push these thoughts away, the more they haunted him. He began to avoid the mirror, looking away as he passed it, as if an invisible force was pushing him away. One night, while he was trying to sleep, he heard a low sound coming from the hallway. It was almost a whisper, so soft that he thought he had imagined it. But the sound continued, a repetitive whisper, as if someone was trying to get his attention. Hesitantly, he got up and walked to the hallway. The mirror was there, still and inert, but with a presence that seemed to intensify. He stood there, staring at the reflection, which seemed deeper and empty. Then, suddenly, the reflection moved. Alone. Tiago felt a coldness take over his body and he was paralyzed. He tried to convince himself that it was all a nightmare, something that would disappear if he blinked or looked away. But the reflection remained there, staring at him with a frightening intensity, as if it were waiting for something. Have you ever imagined if your reflection could see something beyond, something that we cannot see? That was the feeling Tiago had. And what happened next was even more disturbing. Tiago began to avoid the mirror at all costs. He covered its surface with a dark sheet, trying to block out whatever was behind that strange reflection. But it seemed as if the mirror had a presence of its own, something that transcended its physical form. Even covered, he felt that the object continued to watch, waiting for a moment of vulnerability. Tiago's nights became unbearable. He had constant nightmares, all involving the mirror. He dreamed that his reflection moved of its own accord, leaving the frame and wandering around the apartment, watching him as he slept. He woke up in a cold sweat, feeling exhausted as if he had barely rested. The sound of whispers continued, louder and clearer each night, and he began to realize that the words he heard were incomprehensible, but charged with a dark urgency. One morning, Tiago decided to get rid of the mirror. He dragged it out of the apartment and took it to the building's garage, where he left it next to discarded objects. When he returned home, he felt a rare relief. Finally, he could return to normal, or at least that was what he hoped. But the next night, as he walked down the hallway, the mirror was there again in the same place as before. Tiago froze. His thoughts tried to find a rational explanation. Maybe the janitor had brought it back, thinking it was a mistake. He tried to convince himself that this made sense, but deep down he knew that no one in the building would have access to his apartment without his permission. There was no way the mirror would be there again, and yet there it was. With his heart racing, Tiago grabbed the sheet and covered himself again. Now he felt a mixture of fear and anger. He didn't want to be held hostage by that object anymore. He decided that the next morning he would take the mirror far away and destroy it, ensuring that he would never have to deal with it again. That night, however, the terror reached a new level. While he slept, he heard the sound of something heavy being dragged. A dry, metallic noise like wood scraping against the floor. He woke up with a start and was paralyzed when he realized that the sound was coming from the hallway. With his breath held and his heart pounding in his chest, he slowly got up, grabbing a flashlight to light his way. When he reached the hallway, he saw the sheet covering the mirror on the floor, piled up as if it had been ripped off by an invisible force. The mirror was uncovered, and his reflection stared at him differently, as if it had gained a new dimension. Tiago felt an uncontrollable panic and looked away, but his curiosity got the better of him. When he looked back at the mirror, he noticed something that took his breath away. His reflection was smiling. It was not an ordinary smile. It was something distorted, macabre, almost animalistic. Tiago stepped back, but his reflection remained motionless, still with that sinister smile. It was then that he noticed something even more disturbing. The reflection was not in the hallway. It was in a different place, an empty, dark space, with shadows that moved slowly in the background, as if there was something alive on the other side. Tiago screamed and ran back into his room, locking the door behind him. Sitting on the floor, he tried to calm his breathing and understand what was happening. But before he could compose himself, he heard the sound of knocking coming from the hallway. It wasn't just any sound, it was like something was trying to get through, like the mirror was coming to life. The fear began to turn into despair. He knew he couldn't stay in this situation any longer. He grabbed his phone and started looking for help. First he called friends, but no one answered. Then he searched for information online, frantically typing things like cursed mirror and reflection moving by itself. The answers he found were confusing and terrifying. Ancient stories about mirrors being portals to other worlds, about entities that hide in reflections, waiting to take the place of their victims. One story in particular caught his attention. It told of a similar mirror with wooden carvings that told enigmatic stories. He discovered that objects like that were often used in ancient rituals to summon spirits or trap evil entities. The more he read, the more convinced he became that the mirror in his apartment was no ordinary object. Suddenly, the light in the room flickered. Tiago felt a chill run down his spine, and the whisper returned louder than ever. This time he could make out one word, "Come." Tiago knew that something was trying to draw him back into the hallway. But what would he do? Face it or run away? He felt that the choice he made that night could change his life forever. Or worse, it could end it. Tiago stood still, his heart beating so hard he could barely hear anything other than the pulsing sound in his ears. The word "come" echoed in his mind, like an irresistible call that seemed to come from a place beyond human comprehension. He knew that, somehow, the mirror was connected to something sinister, something that did not belong to our world. After agonizing minutes, Tiago gathered courage and decided to face his fear. He took a candle, as he had read that the flame helped to ward off spirits, and cautiously opened the bedroom door. The hallway was dark, and the mirror seemed to be watching him silently, with an almost living presence. Tiago approached the mirror, feeling a shiver run through his entire body. The reflection was still there, smiling in a disturbing way. But then, something strange happened. The image in the mirror began to fade as if it were dissolving into shadows. Little by little, the shadows moved away, revealing an unknown place. It was a vast, shadowy space, like a distorted version of Tiago's own hallway, but much darker and emptier. The walls were stained black as if they had been burned, and a thick fog hung over the floor. He realized that his reflection was no longer there. Instead, a shadowy figure was watching him from the other side. The figure had a shape similar to his own, but it was dark and indistinct, as if it were made of shadows and nothing else. Tiago felt an inexplicable pull to approach the mirror, as if something on the other side was calling him. He reached out his hand almost without realizing what he was doing. As he touched the cold surface of the mirror, he felt a slight resistance, but soon his hand began to sink into the glass as if it were water. A deep fear took hold of him, and he quickly pulled his hand back, feeling as if he had touched emptiness itself. Suddenly, the figure in the mirror began to move, imitating his gestures. But something was wrong. The movements were subtle, slightly uncoordinated, as if the figure was trying to learn how to act like him. Tiago took a step back and the figure took a step forward, almost stepping out of the mirror. He knew he was facing something he wanted more than just to imitate. He wanted to cross over into the real world. Frightened, he stepped back even further, but he heard a whispering voice inside his mind. "Swap places with me, just for a moment, you'll see what I see and I'll see what you see." The proposal was as absurd as it was terrifying, but curiosity mixed with fear kept him from simply running. There was something in that request that stirred him, a promise of knowledge he knew he shouldn't seek, but that was somehow irresistible. Have you ever wondered what's on the other side of the mirror? Is it just a reflection? Or is there a world of its own, with its own secrets and inhabitants? Tiago found himself thinking about these questions as he continued to stare at the shadowy figure who seemed to have infinite patience, waiting for the right moment to cross over. In an impulsive act, he approached the mirror again and with a trembling hand, touched the cold surface again. This time, he felt the resistance disappear completely, as if he were crossing an invisible membrane. He felt a tug as if something was drawing him to the other side. He closed his eyes, trying to resist, but it was too late. When he opened his eyes again, he was no longer in his apartment. He found himself in a place that seemed like a distorted copy of the real world. Everything was in black and white, with shadows dancing around him, creating shapes and figures that seemed to whisper his name. The hallway he was in looked the same, but the atmosphere was dense, oppressive, as if the very air was saturated with an evil presence. Tiago tried to move, but his body felt heavy as if he were being watched from all sides. He looked at the mirror, which now reflected not him, but the shadowy figure that had previously been on the other side. She stared at him, her smile growing wider and wider as if she were pleased. The figure began to imitate his gestures, but with one difference. She seemed alive as if she were him. Tiago's terror grew. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadowy figure seemed to take his place on the other side, while he remained trapped in that empty, dark world. It was then that he realized the truth. He had switched places with the entity. He was now in what they called the other side, a dimension of shadows where every movement was accompanied by a feeling of constant surveillance. Why did the figure want his place in the real world? What did it plan to do with his life while he remained there, trapped forever in that dark reflection? Tiago began to hit the mirror, trying to break the invisible barrier and return to his world, but the glass seemed unbreakable. On the other side, the figure just watched him with a cold and satisfied smile, as if it already knew what he was going through. Desperately, Tiago continued to hit the mirror, feeling his strength drain away with each attempt. He knew he was in a race against time and that, with each second, the dark figure gained more control over what was his. The more he hit, the more he realized that his own reflection was fading, as if he were becoming a shadow in that place. He was condemned to spend the rest of his existence in that void, watching the figure live its life, making its decisions and interacting with its friends and family. Unbeknownst to anyone, he would be forever on the other side, trapped in the reflection of a mirror that now had a life of its own. Tiago was trapped. He knew that, somehow, he had crossed an invisible line that should never have been crossed. The void around him seemed to stretch infinitely, and the figure on the other side of the mirror, now in his place, watched him with a triumphant look. It was as if the entity had been waiting for this moment for centuries, perhaps millennia. He tried to call out to the figure, to scream, to beg for his life back, but no sound came out of his mouth. The mirror was now a solid and impenetrable barrier. He was condemned to watch his own existence being lived by someone else. On the other side, the entity began to explore Tiago's apartment. It picked up his objects, laughed to itself, and even interacted with people through the phone. Tiago could hear fragments of conversations. The entity responded with its voice, but with a strange tone, as if it was adjusting to its new identity. Tiago felt a suffocating despair as he realized that, soon, no one would recognize the difference between him and the figure that had taken over his life. Time on the other side seemed to work differently. Tiago couldn't tell how much time had passed, but each second felt like an eternity. The shadows around him began to move more intensely, as if they were reacting to his despair. He realized he wasn't alone. Other figures, dark and indistinct shapes, began to emerge from the mist. Some had human forms, while others looked like something beyond description. Were they people like him, trapped in that macabre reflection? One of the figures approached, its outlines blurred and shifting. When it tried to speak, its voice was like a distant echo, almost incomprehensible. "You felt too, like the rest of us?" Tiago felt a chill as he heard those words. He wasn't the first, and he clearly wouldn't be the last. The figure continued, "They attract us. Mirrors like that are doors, and each one leads to a prisoner. They switch places, living our lives while we remain here, forgotten." Tiago felt his mind shatter at this revelation. The entity that had taken his place was now him. To the outside world, Tiago was the one who was living, working, laughing, but in truth he was just an imposter. He tried desperately to find a way out. He asked the shadowy figure how he could escape, but the answer was grim. "There is no escape. There is no return. Unless..." The figure hesitated, as if afraid of revealing something dangerous. "Unless you can trick it. There can only be one of you in the mirror. Either you go back or it stays." The words were vague, but they sparked a spark of hope in Tiago. He needed to find a way to force the entity to return to the other side. With this in mind, he began to observe every movement of the figure on the other side. The entity seemed comfortable in its new skin, but Tiago knew it was not perfect. Small flaws appeared, gestures that were unnatural, responses that did not match what he would say. He realized that these imperfections could be the key to exposing the entity. It was then that an idea came to him. He needed to create a distraction, something that would force the entity to look at him. If he could capture its attention and unsettle it, perhaps he could create an opening to reclaim his place. Tiago began to tap the mirror again, but this time with purpose. He tried to synchronize his movements with those of the entity, imitating it so precisely that it began to hesitate. The entity stopped and looked directly at the mirror. For the first time, Tiago saw something different in its eyes: fear. It was as if the figure realized that its position was not as secure as it had imagined. Tiago seized the moment and, with all his strength, projected his will against the invisible barrier. The mirror began to vibrate, emitting a low, pulsing sound, like the lament of something alive. The entity retreated, but before it could escape, Tiago took the final step. He felt his essence launch itself against the figure, as if it were trying to merge with it. The world around him exploded in a flash of light, and he lost consciousness. When he opened his eyes, he was back in his apartment. The floor felt cold beneath his feet, and the air was familiar around him. He ran to the mirror and saw his own reflection, normal and in sync. He fell to his knees, relieved but still in shock. However, something was different. He looked closer, and for a brief moment, he saw a shadow in the background of the reflection, as if something or someone was still there, watching. He covered the mirror again, this time with grim determination. He didn't know if he was truly safe or if the entity still had some control. 4 days later, Tiago got rid of the mirror, taking it to a remote place and destroying it with all his strength. Even so, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Whenever he passed by any reflective surface, he felt something lurking, waiting. After all, did he really manage to escape? Or was the other side more than just a place? Maybe, just maybe, the voice of the mirror was still there, in some corner of his mind, waiting for the right moment to call again.